So with that, we've got, I think, just 2 more sessions to kind of close out our day. And again, we're talking API security best practices right now. And we've got a session coming up in a couple of minutes. Governance doesn't have to be a dirty word, which I love that title. I know a lot of times governance, anything security, but especially governance, it just sort of sounds like the big hammer's about to drop. So definitely a great topic. And our presenter for that topic is Jason Harmon of Stoplight. We'll give him just a minute to join on. And because I forgot to do it at the last, hey Jason, because I forgot to do it at the top of the session, anyone who has questions, oh, hold on. Anyone who's got questions for us or for Jason, just go ahead and drop them into the chat, into the comments, and I will ask them at the end of this session. Jason, you might win the award for the best title for your session, so I'm excited to hear what you have to educate us all around governance and how to make it more palatable, let's say.
Yeah. Are we getting echo or something? I saw notes there about wanting headphones. I can throw those on. Give me a sec. All right. Well, I don't think their headphones are playing nice. Sorry, I didn't follow directions. Does everything sound okay? All right. I'm going to go with that's a yes. So somebody yell at me in chat if not. So, yeah, I'm Jason. Let's see here. We'll jump forward. So I guess here's my list of why you should probably listen. As stated, I'm CTO at Stoplight.io. I pretty much head up all of our sort of geeky stuff, engineering, product, security, IT. I also host our API Intersection podcast, where we kind of talk to practitioners who generally are running kind of successful API programs. I myself also was a practitioner at places like Expedia and PayPal that you've heard of, and other places you may or may not have heard of that are smaller startups. So this is all to say that we talk to a lot of folks that do this sort of thing. And while the talk isn't expressly about security, I'll kind of highlight where I think there's some obvious bits in here. So we'll start with a little storytelling. The beard's growing out, so I've got enough gray you can tell how old I am. And back in the SOA era, I've been kind of reflecting on this lately. How different it was back then in kind of developing SOAP services. So I was working at a large company that had acquired a startup I was at, and learned that the SOAP service I was building needed to go through a governance process. That turned into making sure that my program manager knew about it from the big dog organization. Yes, that's what they called their program management. Any of you that worked there will know where I'm talking about. But I had to lobby to make sure that my service was going to get reviewed in the right time cycle, because they only met every 2 weeks, and it was run by basically a bunch of sort of nameless, faceless architects who would, tell me what I did wrong. I found myself having to learn all these WS standards I'd never heard of. I didn't know why I needed to do them. So I just did a bunch of stuff to kind of turn the lights green and clear all the comments. I think it's important to recognize that, at that time, that was very normal. And I think it was reflective of the fact that at an industry level, SOAP itself was determined by the largest companies. So Microsoft made up SOAP, right? They defined that spec. And then by the time we got to SOAP 1.2, IBM and a few others had joined on, to determine for the rest of the industry how we were going to integrate. So, that era, that kind of SOA SOAP era, was defined by centralized control, which innately tended to always be kind of this large, slow moving thing. It was usually the bottleneck in trying to ship services. Um, and all of this was, really a power structure of an industry consortium, top down. We are the biggest players. We'll tell you all how to do it. Um, that I think, again, just this all sort of characterized the era. So for me, the biggest change that's happened over the last, sort of 15 years is really the prevalence of open source and the culture that came with it. So when we look at like SOAP and how that came together through this top-down industry consortium versus REST as an architectural pattern, it's not a standard, right? Before someone throws rocks at me. But I think this certainly includes a variety of other things too, not just REST. It's just a great example and the most prevalent thing people are doing. And what's, that all came up through a bottoms-up approach. And really that open source approach of, there's a few committers, a community of people around them who are providing input, feedback, contribution. That really created a culture change in software. And when we look back now, 15 years back, to the way that standards and things were defined, it feels completely alien and foreign. This talk really is about, when we say governance, we don't mean the old way. And I think people that use words to dance around governance and kind of make it like an excuse, or, we need to call it something else because that word is just spoiled. I really think we have to reclaim the term governance and just redefine what we mean in the modern era on making it work, right? I think the first and most important aspect that we've certainly learned from API intersection podcast guests, as well as Stoplight customers, and just talking to folks around the industry, is a decentralized approach is key. And I'm not talking, scams like NFT and other decentralized things like that, a little more common sense. But I think there's a few key attributes to this sort of federated approach that people will call it. And the first is screw the org chart. Find the group of people that are passionate about APIs. They get it. They understand how to, why platforms are important, what good API design is all about, that sort of thing. So I tend to call this like the band of rebels, is, find the right folks who get it and create a space to have a community. So within a company, this is often, this could include go take a road trip, but most likely is just ask around. And there are, in each domain is usually somebody that everyone leans on for this. And that starts kind of building the network, right? From there, I think, is building a mindset on, building a single use case throwaway API is just a waste of everyone's time. Thinking about how the next API that's going to get developed is a piece of a bigger ecosystem. And that may or may not include connections to other platforms, but even within your own company is, let's develop shared leverage, right? Let's build things that can be reusable. And that's a mindset, right? It's a different way of looking at things versus, the API is the bullet point on some feature that you ship. While the decentralization is important, building this network of folks that can help kind of make the transformation happen, it is also important to have a group of the sort of curators, right? The folks who are taking care of standardizing things for the company and ultimately making some decisions about how things are going to look. And they should have a special kind of authority. And that is, they're allowed to sort of reach out to anyone, build connections across the company, throw the org chart out the window. So this sort of silo breaking mandate. And to be clear, we regularly talk to companies with, anywhere from, 10,000 to 75,000 people, huge companies that might have 3 to 5 people. So this is not a huge investment that we're talking in most cases. But ultimately somebody has to kind of, tend that garden. And then kind of pulling it all together is really, it is essential to have sort of a management mandate, right? Someone at the top who's sort of saying to everyone, this is important. But one way to get there and to convince them to do that, much less the way to kind of get things done in general, is just by building influence. And that's a subtle art for sure. To some extent, it's like build cool things and others will follow. But it's, again, a kind of network building approach is key. I think for anybody who's sort of managed or led engineers, if you stand up and tell a bunch of engineers what to do, you'll almost definitely get the opposite result. So it's important to kind of, build this influence and get folks kind of on your side, right? Another piece of this is InnerSource. And so I talked before about how open source and the culture that it brought changed a lot of the way that we look at these things. And where we see a lot of platform transformations fail is, in very simple terms, people can't communicate. They can't share code. And there's a protectionism mindset that I've got to stay in my bubble. And if I cross out of it, or if I let someone into my bubble, bad things will happen. So in very simple terms, your developers have to be able to share and look at each other's code. And while, building kind of decoupled things, sure, it's important that you don't need to connect code. You're connecting via APIs. Being able to join forces when you recognize that, hey, especially if you're doing a design first approach, we're all, 3 or 4 teams are designing roughly the same functionality. Let's share, right? Let's build shared leverage from the moment we start building it. If those things aren't possible because of simple access controls, you're really missing the boat on letting the company reshape itself around the way it's going to be, and instead entrenching yourself into the way it is. So this, in some sense, is all about, platform thinking. How do we shift from, shipping the next revenue generating thing into, we are building a platform. We're all working together on a shared vision. All right. So a little fluffy, a little soft to this point. We'll kind of dig into some specifics here, and I'll start trying to call out some of the security points here. When we look at, what is this all about today? I think first, we hear a lot of this kind of API first thrown around, which I think is kind of like microservices for me, that I don't know that we'll ever know what it means exactly. But I think one of the key characteristics is you stop thinking of APIs as a technical artifact or an engineering produced thing, and instead start thinking about, these are your products. These are your, strategic capabilities. I'm actually doing a talk on this tomorrow, so small plug for that, a whole session on this. So this is kind of the teaser version of it with the highlights. I think first is we've seen over the last year or two, we follow titles very closely because they're usually meaningless in platform work, but increasingly we're actually seeing a trend of API product manager as a title. This is early days in some ways of that kind of role. So it is ever changing, right? This is evolving as we speak. I call out not necessarily technical in the sense that, while lots of API product managers come from an architecture background, increasingly we're seeing that describing the capability that you need as an API doesn't necessarily need technical skills in any depth, especially if you have the right experience of tooling. We certainly have customers at Stoplight that they have product managers who are designing the APIs because they put the right sort of governance guardrails in place. We'll touch on how to make that possible toward the end. This, I think, is indicative of a broader trend that we see, which is a more inclusive process. And I think this is actually one of our touch points with the security world here. The idea that engineers will design an API, and then surly engineers will review it and tell them what they did wrong. In the old way is not going to do it with business strategic critical assets like we're building in many companies around APIs. So, like if all of your reviews are happening in GitHub PRs, you're probably excluding a huge community of people who have critical input to the process, not the least of which is your security teams. Certainly business analysts and program managers. This is an opportunity for everyone to align, but we'll touch on that too. The other reason that I think a lot of companies are starting to invest in API-centric product management is that partnerships are increasingly defined by how APIs will, connect these platforms, connect these products, and someone managing that sort of relationship is key. So for API product managers, if you find yourself in that seat, whether you get the title or not, a couple of just highlights of things to focus on. One is, it can be overwhelming to define an API when you think about how will the whole world connect with it. So recognizing what relationships are you enabling with this API from a business perspective? Is this internal shared leverage? Is this connecting to other platforms to give your customers more functionality? Is this a wide open to the world thing and you're going to get developers off the street? All of that will heavily influence the nature of what it is that you're building, not the least of which is your auth systems, which is often the long pole in the tent of API development, right? So for product managers, a great place to start to make sure that you have all the aligned interests around why you're building it, which is probably more important than the content of it. But it's kind of a way to scope down and focus on a particular set of functionality that's business relationship enabling. I mentioned before having kind of that leadership mandate and building kind of support for these things is requisite. And I think for each API project, it's important that you have the business folks on the same page as to why this is happening. So as I mentioned with relationships, that's key, right? What kind of relationship are we enabling should also help us understand what are the commercial outcomes that this is going to produce? Why is this good for our business's growth? That sort of thing. And then a completely shift from the rest, but it's just important to call out. When you're building an API as a product manager, you should be investing heavily in test automation. This is going to be the most testable product you've ever built. It's just not like your UX point and click type experiences where you've got to have someone that clicks through it to figure out if it works, or the automated testing is kind of flaky and you're not too sure about it. You really shouldn't have much excuse for releasing, bugs to the world. And if you do, you have zero excuse to ever release them again. This is inherently a programmatic interface. So QA is your best friend. If you don't have QA, have a great testing strategy with the engineers on your team. So why invest in API as a product? Why think this way? It's, in the user experience world, if we said, hey, give basic requirements to a bunch of engineers and we'll produce a great experience, everyone would laugh at you. That would be ridiculous. And I think it's just as ridiculous to think the same thing about APIs. This is not a technical artifact, that you don't make this a commodity. You don't want to have an engineered experience for your APIs, right? You need to design this, and to do so well in a way that's aligned with your business interests, you've got to have, again, this inclusive process. And more importantly, all of this should be defined by who is the customer. And in the API world, that can mean a lot of things for sure, but having a customer-centric perspective on how you design these things with all the right interests aligned, that produces, world-changing stuff as opposed to the bullet point on some feature that you're shipping. Okay, so we're thinking about the API as a product, and we perhaps built a network around this process of folks who get it, right? That we're, we're going to start engaging. In simple terms, when you're designing APIs, there should be some kind of review process. So as much as I was, kind of griping about the old SOA world of, oh no, I've got to go to the committee, it is important to do reviews, and let's kind of walk through how that is different than it used to be. So in some ways, like the SOAP era was defined by salty principal engineers, right? The folks at the top of the technical ladder who would, deem who was fit and who wasn't on some technical grounds. I think in the modern era, we, again, kind of look at this as a product that needs to be intentionally designed and distribute authority. So this is also a reflection on, we talked about, having that silo busting kind of curating group. It's key that you don't put people who thrive on wielding power over others in that position. You need to have folks who are great at building community and who want to, work themselves out of a job to some extent and giving away that authority, building a relationship with somebody in a given domain who gets it, and then passing the torch. It is the only way to scale. You can't possibly invest in some monster center of excellence that's going to keep up without being a bottleneck. That's what was broken in the SOA era fundamentally. So this is governance. This is the things we can make possible, right? Let's own it. Let's not avoid it. So summarizing it a bit, kind of the new review process, again, more inclusive. This can't just be engineers looking at each other's work. You're going to get a system-centric view. It's almost unavoidable. Think about your review process like an open source project. You have folks contributing to it. You have folks curating things. They're maintaining things. And then you have non-technical stakeholders, right? You've got to look at this a little bit more loosely than perhaps you're used to looking at some other software things, because it's more than just software in this case. You've got to have that platform thinking mindset that this is not one API that we're going to ship as a part of a bigger feature. This is a key business asset that needs to fit into a larger picture. And perhaps that picture could be as big as, how does this connect with other platforms around us? And that takes a different perspective, right? Why do all this stuff? Why have the review? One, better developer experience. And, I think this is a hand-wavy term sometimes that folks think, well, this is just, this is our developer portal. No, it's much more than that. When you get down into actually using an API, how it's designed fundamentally changes your experience, right? So review it, be intentional. That all results in, a more innovative environment that's going to produce happier customers, satisfied partners, that sort of thing. So, when folks are asking why do this, here's some reasons. Now, the final one I want to call out on increased scalability. The engineers are going to jump to, oh, why is this going to make it go faster? Why is this going to make it handle more calls? But I think there's a lot more to it than just the technical scalability. And I think that can be dealt with, in its own right. What I'm talking about here is organizational scalability. Your ability to produce many, many APIs that don't feel like a jumble of APIs. They feel like one platform. So that ability to scale a platform and scale an organization around a platform, I think the review process and kind of the inclusivity and alignment around it is one of the key factors to making it all work. Okay, so we bounced around. We touched on a lot of different things in here. So wrapping it up a little bit. And, I should say here, and I probably should have said from the start, I think for folks looking at security governance, I think almost all of this is applicable. But knowing that API-based security issues are one of the top issues now, you can do a lot of good on the security side of API definitions and specifications at design time. And in fact, if you don't do it and you wait until the CI/CD pipeline to catch things, your security team is now the bottleneck, right? So let's shift all that stuff left. So that's not called out here, but it's worthy of mention for security-minded folks. But again, just to recap, we want to give away control and maintain a very small amount that's dedicated to defining things like standards, so that, on our second point, we can maintain consistency, right? So that bunch of APIs feels like one platform and not a jumble. We do have to have a small centralized team that's doing that curation so that there are some rules, right? Everybody wants to go to the party. Nobody wants to stay and clean up. Let's have some rules. And then treating your API as a product, you could have a perfect review process and everything decentralized, beautiful. And if these are single use case throwaway things, it doesn't really matter. So these should be reusable products in many different environments. And that takes an inclusive process across the course of development, but certainly at the design phase at the beginning. And finally, something I didn't call out expressly, but it's worthy of mention, is especially for that sort of curator group of folks, the governors, so to speak, it's really important to educate and evangelize why all these things are necessary. And my best advice on this is explain what happens if you don't, right? So when you're engaging with folks and saying, hey, here's the process that would be great for you to follow, and here's kind of the help we can provide. Here's what we're helping you avoid. Here's the traps that you could fall into if you've never done this before. We have some experience. We've worked with other parts of the organization. We're going to make you look cool, and we're going to keep you out of trouble. I think if you don't invest in that stuff, a lot of folks will just try to sidestep the process and just think this is bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. So, doing the roadshow, traveling to development centers, putting out online content, just educating folks, right, can make a huge difference in adoption and engagement. So final thought is just a couple of, kind of tools and approaches. One is style guides. And I think kind of the old world of this is you write a big tome of rules and ways in which you should design things. I think increasingly there's ways to automate this that make it really easy to enforce things like naming conventions, the boring stuff that we suck at reviewing as humans. I'll plug here our open source project Spectral, which is wildly popular, freaks us out all the time. It's all over the place, but it's because it works really well at defining rule sets for, catching these boring things. Collaboration tools, make sure you have a place that more than just engineers can talk about things. Again, if you're doing it in GitHub PRs, you're excluding everyone else most likely. Defining things that can be shared, namely models, but certainly this can apply to parameters, headers, that sort of thing, is define some central definition for things that should be the same for everyone. A good example would be contact information, addresses. You want to define that one ways in practical terms. So like your localization systems will work with all your different APIs, but from a usability standpoint, it's great too. And if you're not hiring product managers thinking about APIs, you might want to try to, get out there. There is not enough talent, and this is a developing field. So you might also think about how to educate your product managers on APIs. And certainly mild plug for Stoplight here. This is kind of all the stuff we do. So, we make it easy to make those things happen. And my final plug is if you haven't listened to our API Intersection podcast, tune in. It's on all the different podcast platforms, and come join the community. And if you're into this stuff, come be a guest, reach out. That's all I got. I think I ran out of time. Sorry.
That's all right, Jason. That was a great session. And I think, I truly appreciate kind of your words of wisdom around governance, and that we have to abandon the way that we think of governance from the past, and that really it's about, it's about that collaboration and inclusivity up front so that we're all doing the right things and have those guardrails in place, which prevents all sorts of headaches down the line, right? And the one question
it all sounds kind of obvious when you say it out loud, but it's shocking how often
it's not, though. It really isn't. We hear it all the time. And I'll use one quick example, and then we've got to jump to our last presentation. But I think one of the things that we hit on all the time is the notion of discovery, right? And this discovery is a huge problem. Shadow APIs and discovery, and one of the pushbacks that we always come back with, and that truly is credited to a lot of API product managers specifically, or platform owner, API platform owners, is really that's a governance issue, right? Like if you don't have a discovery problem, you have a governance problem. And let's reset how we think about API governance. or governance as it relates to APIs and go from there, right? Because you'll
Yeah,
never the discovery game. Like you'll never.
There are certainly, tools and approaches to help get caught up if you haven't been doing it. But once you get caught up, being intentional up front really makes a big difference, and not having to try to catch it all on the back end.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who asked questions of Jason, I know one of the questions was what resources, and that was in that last slide. So you can catch the replay if you missed where those resources are, what they are. The replay will be out on Apidays YouTube channel. So with that, I'm going